Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Reviews. This is a series in which I look at books in philosophy in a very broad sense, including ethics, professional applications of philosophy, leadership, self-help, and all sorts of other matters. The book that I've got this time is one that I've really enjoyed reading and also interviewing the author of. It is Krista Thomason's 2024, so fairly recent, Dancing with the Devil, Why Bad Feelings Make Life Good. And so it's a book definitely within, you can call it the philosophy of emotion, or we sometimes call this moral psychology. And we're going to talk about a lot of different features of the book. I'll give you sort of a summary of it. Then we'll look at some of the key ideas. We'll talk about the good points and the bad points of this book. But I will say that I really have enjoyed it. I always like to begin by talking about the three S's, the style of the work, the structure of the work, and providing kind of a summary of the work before we get into the really key ideas in a bit more thorough manner. So I'm going to start out by saying that Thomason is a really good writer. And this is one of those books that is going to bring in a lot of, again, writ large philosophy. So not people necessarily who thought of themselves as philosophers, but definitely who could be taught in philosophy classes. There's going to be people from the ancients all the way up to contemporary figures from the 20th, even 21st century. And it's, done in a very, let's say, well-integrated fashion. So Thomason, like some of the other people who I've talked about in the past, has a talent for not losing rigor or accuracy, but being able to write for a general non-academic audience. So, I think if you like reading interesting works, this is going to be a good one. And it's got a pretty provocative thesis, which we'll get to in just a moment. But I do want to talk about the structure of the work. So it's really divided into two main parts. There is an introduction, right? But that's part of part one, the garden. And there's 3 chapters in that: Emotional Saints, Taming the Beasts, and Make Room for the Devil. And then part 2 is called The Worms. And the chapters of those show you that what she's interested in as these particular worms are different, generally held to be negative, and because of that, bad emotion. So chapter 4 is on anger. Chapter 5, envy and jealousy. Chapter 6, spite and schadenfreude. Chapter 7, contempt. And then the conclusion is called loving the wild. So what we have here is a metaphor that will explore in a bit of a garden, worms, the jobs that worms are doing in the garden. And that tells you about the structure. It is a, academic book, Oxford University Press. So it does also have, extensive notes and, there are end notes, which I'm never a real fan of, but maybe some of you are as well. And then it's got a decent index as well. So, it's got the regular apparatus that you would expect in a scholarly work, but it is really written for academics can read it and get a lot of it. It is written for a non-academic audience, I would say. And a summary of it, if we had to, give a thumbnail sketch of it, not one of the ones that's on the back. She's got some pretty important people, Misha Cherry, Michael Cholby, philosophers of emotion, giving blurbs about it. Here's the summary of it. So a lot of people think that negative emotions are essentially negative. They're bad. They're ethically bad. They're bad for us. In other ways, the goal should be to minimize them or perhaps get rid of them altogether or only make use of them insofar as they serve some proper aim or end. And Thomason wants to argue that on the one hand, these negative emotions arise because we're not saints and don't have to be saints or sages or perfect people, and they can arise out of bad parts of ourselves, but they can also arise because we're human beings living in a world that is a matrix of relationships with other people where we do, say, compare ourselves against other people or need to push back occasionally or sometimes require motivation to get things accomplished. And so maybe they're not as negative as we take them to be. There's no sort of, we could say, blanket, anger is always good, jealousy is always good thing going on here. But Thomason wants to, open up, expand the range of when it might be, not a great thing to be angry, but an understandable and good thing, or getting to more negative emotions, maybe even schadenfreude or spite or contempt could in fact be not perfectly right or good, but right in this particular situation. So she's making an extended argument here by way of bringing in all sorts of philosophical thinkers and ideas and psychology as well to argue this case bit by bit by bit that the bad feelings might actually have something good to them for our human lives. All right, so let's talk about key ideas of the work. I mentioned she is using a extended metaphor here. The title or the introduction is called Weeds, Worms, and Communing with the Dead. So weeds and worms are part of this important metaphor. The idea is that our lives are kind of like a garden, and our garden can have weeds in it that we need to pull out. But, what counts as weeds are not always so bad. We might think of dandelions, which we view as weeds, which are actually quite a nice flower that produces things that you can eat in salad and use for other purposes as well. There's a kind of a beauty in a dandelion head and the seeds as they're flying off. Maybe if you want a manicured lawn, it's not the best thing. So we've got a garden, and she says the garden is your life, and bad feelings like anger, envy, spite, and contempt are the weeds. A lot of people think you need to pull them up before they choke out the nice plants. You can't get rid of them completely, but you're supposed to battle them the best you can. Now, she says we need to change this way of thinking. Bad feelings are not the weeds. What are they? The worms. And now, if you don't know what worms are for, you might be like, oh, they're just as bad as weeds. Well, no. If you actually understand what earthworms' function is, you want earthworms, right? They're just below the surface. You see them slimy and crawly, churning in the dirt. But worms are as much a part of the garden as the flowers, and their presence mean your garden is thriving. Wishing away your worms is wishing away the richness and texture of the garden itself. And so she says this book will help you love your worms. That is part of the idea here. And she's going to tell us that emotions are serving some useful purposes for us. For example, they help us to realize things before we consciously do. If you feel frustrated and angry at work every day, it's probably a sign something isn't right, right? That's a good example. And she says that emotions are also reflections of what we care about or what matter to us. She uses the word constitutive of our commitments and the things that we value. And she uses philosophy as an example, saying, I'm committed to it because I care about it. I'm susceptible to a whole set of emotions about philosophy. And our relationship to our emotions is not always easy, she says. She also brings up this common opposition between head and heart that you still see a lot of people doing today. There's the intellect, and then there's our feelings. There's rationality, then there's emotions. There's the head, there's the heart. And, like most good philosophers of emotion and going all the way back to ancient virtue ethics, the goal is not to get rid of your emotions. The goal is not to say, well, there's rationality, cold logic, and then emotions. The goal is to actually connect them together in ways that integrate them and make sense. And she says, romanticism is kind of not helpful for us in this respect, and neither would be the Mr. Spock kind of, I'm only about logic sort of thing as well. She's going to go on, and she's going to say, I speak to dead people. Basically, I engage with dead people. That's a humanistic approach. A lot of times when it comes to emotions, we buy into claims made by people who, want to say that what they're doing is scientific, not all that namby-pamby, loosey-goosey stuff that other people have been doing. But actually, that's not really true. That's a bit of, unproven ideology there. We should be going to Aristotle, and we should be going to Shakespeare, and we should be going to Confucius and to others to better understand these important aspects of ourselves. And so she's going to, deliberately advocate taking a humanistic approach. She calls it dialectical. She uses Aristotle as an example there in one of the very first scientific treatises on psychology. On the soul. He says that you can understand anger in physiological terms, or you can understand it as a dialectician would, a psychologist, we would say, or a ethical philosopher. And as a matter of fact, it turns out that anger is quite complex for Aristotle. So going on to chapter 1. So she's going to engage in a kind of portrayal and then criticism of what she calls emotional saints. And there's going to be two important types of emotional saints discussed in this book. So she is going to look first at the kind of sainthood that she calls controlled emotion saints, right? Where you tamp it down. You try to, as much as you can, eliminate your emotions. Not all emotions, just the bad ones, just the negative emotions. Ideally, you'd get rid of them altogether. She brings up the example of the Stoics, specifically, Seneca as an example with respect to anger, of, rejecting emotion. And she is going to talk about new Stoics, as she calls them. I'll come back to that in a bit. And then she talks about some other ideas. Another contemporary version of emotional sainthood is the rise of, as she says, mindfulness. And, she views that mindfulness is usually referring to a watered down or commercialized version of ideas associated with the Indic tradition, what we would call, the Dharmic religions, but, philosophical as well. So Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, all of that. Primarily Buddhism. She also talks about technology and the interests of tech bros in both Stoicism and mindfulness. And then, she comes back to talking about the actual Stoics. For example, Epictetus, and the possibility of the Stoic sage who won't have traditions, she says, in the traditional emotions in the traditional sense. They've achieved apatheia, or unaffectedness. They have all the correct beliefs about the world. Now, whether there's Stoic sages or not, that's a whole different matter. Then she talks about somebody much more recent from what she's calling the Indic tradition, namely Mohandas Gandhi, right? And the interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita that he is putting forth. The main lesson of the Gita is to teach self-realization through renunciation, which, isn't just Gandhi, of course, but plenty of others as well. And she says that the Stoics and Gandhi have complex philosophical cosmologies that lead them to their views about negative emotions. So what do they advocate? The controlled emotion saints think emotions threaten our control over our minds. So the goal is to have more control over these emotions and ideally, remove these irrational things from our life. She talks about a more, let's say, truncated version of this, trying to achieve peace of mind without underlying commitments to radically different views of the universe. And so one of the interesting ways she talks about this is let's call it the cult of positivity. She brings up Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positivity. And we can think about so many other similar movements manifesting. Certain interpretations of positive psychology, I would say, figure into this, although she doesn't talk about that quite so much. And she thinks this is a mistaken approach, this whole, controlled emotion saint viewpoint. So she goes on then in the second chapter to talk about another kind of emotional saint. She calls these cultivated emotion saints. And the idea here is that through training, through discipline, through education, we can start to cultivate our emotions so that we have emotions, even bad emotions, but in the right way, to the right amount. Now, when you're hearing that, you might be thinking, sounds like Aristotle. And she does, in fact, talk a lot about Aristotle here. She also talks about Confucius and the Confucian tradition as doing this. So that also makes sense as well. We could also see, something like rational emotive behavior therapy as figuring into this as well. And she says, how do they do this? They recognize the importance of emotions in the good life, right? Surely they'll say there's something wrong with the person who doesn't grieve the untimely death of his favorite student, or the person who isn't angry at the disrespectful thug in the bar. And she says, so this is better than the controlled emotion saints, but it's still not exactly where we want to go. She says, this does give us a way of having agency without getting rid of our emotions. We try to cultivate them so they're appropriate to the circumstances. But there's some emotions that can't actually be approved. For example, both for Confucius and Aristotle, envy is never going to be good, right? So then she brings up William James and, this idea that he has about cultivating the wilderness within us, and that maybe that would be a good idea. She also talks about W. Du Bois and his views about, his emotional responses and other people's emotional responses in terms of racist society, and says that, maybe we shouldn't polish our emotions too much. Maybe we need these negative emotions. Sometimes we're feeling them wrongly, but maybe sometimes we need to be feeling them. And she talks about something she calls the emotion double standard. She says it's at work when people attribute things to negative emotions they would never attribute to positive emotions. For example, people say negative emotions are like drugs and you'll get addicted to them if you feel them too much. Nobody warns you about getting addicted to joy or gratitude. And she says good feelings can cause us all sorts of troubles, right? And actually, funnily enough, the Stoics thought that too much elation could be problematic. But, we've already sort of written off the Stoics at this point. And then, she's going to discuss science a bit more. She's going to look at Darwin and his book, The Expression of Emotions in Men and Animal, and maybe some of these, negative emotions could be helpful for us. But we do have to be careful, she points out, with evolutionary ideas, particularly if we're going to make everything science-based. She says that all this research, studies on evolutionary psychology or the health benefits of this or that feeling relies on a misguided way of valuing your emotions. It assumes emotions are valuable only if they provide some tangible gain. They're treated as a means to a desired goal. And here's where she actually does talk about positive psychology as a movement. Chapter 3 is called Make Room for the Devil. And the devil that she has in mind is the Satan from Paradise Lost who feels things. He's stirred up with envy and revenge, right? And Satan, as she says, uses his negative emotions to create justifications for his actions. He turns his envy into righteous indignation and convinces rebel angels. His emotional life, she says, is the most human thing about him. And his self-love might be sinful, but self-love on our part doesn't necessarily have to be. And so she says our bad feelings are actually expressions of our self-love, our investment in our lives and ourselves. When I envy my neighbor's beautiful house, it's because I want a house like that for my own life. It's part of how I define success for myself, right? Then she goes on and she talks about Buddhism. And I'll talk about her treatment of Buddhism in a bit, which I think is quite good. And she says that, it's a very interesting interpretation that she has here. She says, most Buddhist philosophers believe that there's two ways of seeing the world, the conventional way and the real way. And attaining enlightenment means seeing the world the way it really is. Our attachments and aversions originate from illusions, and none of this is as it seems. So negative emotions are one of the classic symptoms of someone who is under a delusion of having a self. And she goes on to talk about, being open to community, compassion, and love, the connection between caring less about yourself and greater feelings of communities. A community, however, isn't as straightforward as Buddhists make it out to be. So she's not endorsing Buddhism as it's so much better than everything else. She's saying, well, they have some limitations as well. And then she brings in Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche thought we should, in fact, be selfish if we have the right kind of self, which is up to us. We can certainly cultivate it if we want to. I should mention, too, that along the way in the discussion on Buddhism, she actually brings up Iris Murdoch. And she thinks that, one of the main aims of philosophy is to figure out how to defeat the fat, relentless ego, to become more selfless, not necessarily as far as certain Buddhist views. So then she goes on and, brings up Nietzsche and also Montaigne. Nietzsche thinks that our souls are sick and that the saint, the emotional saint, is to blame for the illness. So the saint responds to human imperfection with contempt and rejection, and Nietzsche says that we should try to reject that, to get away from that. What the saint called corruption was just part of being a human who's fully alive in the world, right? And she brings up nihilism, saying for Nietzsche, the opposite of life isn't death. It's actually nihilism. We stop living when life stops mattering to us. So, here she's going to make a really interesting point. She thinks that one of the mistakes that people make when they start actually understanding and appreciating their emotions is thinking that we always have to do something with them, right? That an emotion is a sign that we need to act on some way. And she says this is one of the most common traps we fall into. Why are we so prone to it? One reason is the bad reputation bad feelings have. Because we think of them as bad feelings, and because we think, well, it could be okay if I do something good with those bad feelings, we fall into the illusion of thinking we need to do something with them, right? We also, as she says, think we have to control our negative emotions because if we let them loose, they'll torch everything in our lives, and that's not necessarily true. So what does she counsel instead? Being honest with ourselves about what it is we actually do feel, how we feel it, and then not necessarily acting on it. She says, once you've admitted what you feel, think about why you might be feeling it. What is it actually telling you? And that's quite important, right? So that is the first part of the book. Part 2 begins with chapter 4, and that is about anger. And she is going to look at Seneca, which, makes perfect sense because Seneca has an entire book on anger. She's also going to look at Shantideva, a Buddhist who writes about anger. And both of them think that, we shouldn't really give into it. We should try to eliminate anger. And that's because they're both acting as emotional controlled emotion saints, right? There's also cultivated emotion saints like Aristotle and Confucius. Both of them think that you should get angry sometimes. She also talks about 2 influential defenses of anger appearing in the 1980s from Marilyn Frye and Audre Lorde, 2 feminist philosophers, looking at women's anger and, having some places where anger could be useful. So like she says, Seneca and Shantideva paint a portrait of anger red in tooth and claw, bent on destruction. Frye and Lorde paint a portrait of anger standing defiant against those who want a boot on our neck. And she says, so we can distinguish between bad anger and potentially useful or good anger, right? And it's not just about feeling too much of it. It's about, the things that we get angry about or why we get angry about it. And then she says, the idea that anger is good when it's about the right things presumes somewhere there's a master list of things that are worth getting mad about. Figuring out who has good or bad reasons for anger is, however, harder than it looks. So she's, suggesting that a lot of the time we're probably mistaken with our anger, but we can, in fact, have good anger. She explores the issue of righteous anger and says that there could be some good points about this, but if we defend it as the only good anger, then we have some downsides. People are fond of telling you should use your anger constructively to fight injustice. But again, this falls into the trap of treating emotions just as means to an end. And she says, I'm not saying we shouldn't be angry about injustice, but anger about injustice isn't a special or noble kind of anger. So, that's quite interesting. She's got a great little subsection here about the internet and the outrage machine. She looks at incels as an example of this and, how we can avoid making monsters out of anger. So that's chapter 4. Chapter 5 is about envy and jealousy. And she's got this set up and so anger, we could probably make cases for. Envy and jealousy, that's tougher, right? But she manages to do that as well. And she's going to say that jealousy is always a possibility in any human relationship because we care about people and we want to preserve our relationship with them. Now, it can be bad in many respects. It can be dangerous. It can be backward, unenlightened. There can be all sorts of problems with it. But it is likely to arise, and it may even be there in some healthy relationships, according to her. She also talks about envy, and envy is, often viewed as always bad, but perhaps it has to do to some degree with self-esteem. Not just a lack of it, a hole in a person, but in, relation to thinking that we are owed things. It's a sign that we think that something is unfair, and sometimes societies can be unfair. She is, however, skeptical of any attempt to turn envy into a good thing by itself, right? So she says, in order for envy to be redeemed, an argument goes, we have to use it to do something good. We have to use it as fuel to improve ourselves, or motivation to address inequality or injustice. And she says, well, yeah, that works provided you've actually got things right, but perhaps you don't. And it can lead us into being quite materialistic and driven to rivalry and, having all sorts of fantasies about things. Then in chapter 6, which is about spite and schadenfreude, and now we're getting to things where they seem even worse, right? There can't be any good uses or forms or anything of these. And she gives some interesting examples of this that I think hit very home. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. The psychiatrist Jonathan Metzl interviewed groups of white men from Tennessee about healthcare. They all suffered from chronic illnesses. Some relied on Veterans Affairs or Medicaid for their care. Despite this, when the topic of government-sponsored universal health care came up, they decried it as socialism. They bristled at the thought their tax dollars would go to support health care for Mexicans and welfare mothers. Ample evidence shows that expanding health care would help the men in the focus group as much as it would help members of racial minorities, but they would rather do without life-saving care than see someone they didn't like reap the same benefit. Spite can create Pepe Le Pew, but it can also kill you. So who does she bring up in this case? Spinoza, of all people. And she's got a section called Spinoza and the Affects of Hate. So, things like Schadenfreude, actually all these negative emotions from Spinoza's point of view are kind of mixed up viewpoints on human affairs and on the universe. She also talks about sports rivalries, and sports rivalries are places where Schadenfreude, the delight in somebody else's suffering, can easily appear. So she brings up the Red Sox because, she's got that in her background. We could think here in the Midwest about Packers fans loving when the Bears do poorly and actually having a song called The Bears Still Suck, And she says that, there could be there's a lot of cases of Schadenfreude where it's just kind of bad. But Michel Montaigne, the great essayist, in his essay on the cannibals, seems to be drawing on Schadenfreude to promote laughter. That could actually be good in some respects. The targets of our Schadenfreude are the ones who act like they're above it all, but we know differently. They're down here in the muck with the rest of us. When they fall on their faces, our Schadenfreude is an emotional I told you so, right? So, maybe there's something to this. She also talks about a human defiance streak that spite is part of. And maybe Schadenfreude is an emotion that lies in human connectedness, and spite is an emotion that recognizes we also need our space. She also talks about Montaigne and the civil wars that were taking place in France. And she notes, she's got a really great discussion in here about tribalism and what we could call zero-sum thinking. If you do better, I do worse. So I want to see you do worse so I can feel like I'm doing better. And, that, she says, spite and Schadenfreude show up when self-building, constituting the self, gets adversarial, but they're not the cause of that hostility. We could look at the actual causes. Then we get to the last chapter, contempt. And it might be, we could think of this also in terms of disgust. So contempt, you're looking down on, despising somebody. And she brings up a number of different people, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Mary Wollstonecraft. And it's interesting because Rousseau thinks that living in civilized society makes us more contemptuous of other people. And Wollstonecraft points out that Rousseau shows contempt towards half of mankind, women, right? And that actually we need to become more civilized. We're not at full civilization. And she had this interesting fear that contempt would turn the poor into a permanent social underclass. And she saw women as being trapped in these things. Now, Thomason is going to say, given her criticisms, you might assume Wollstonecraft would try to convince us to get rid of contempt altogether, but you'd be mistaken. She shows contempt against Burke, whose arguments she is refuting, right? So what Wollstonecraft laments about contempt is not that we feel it, but we feel it towards the wrong things. We should have contempt for vice and folly, she thinks, right? So then she talks about contemporary philosophers who defend some notion of contempt, and she also brings up this phrase, blue skies, the blue sky of contempt, once again bringing up W. Du Bois and the souls of black folk. Du Bois is discriminated against because of racial prejudice, but he excels, and so he can feel contempt towards the people who feel contempt towards him. And, he talks about this as a blue sky. And so, this is about comparison. This is about status. This is about how we understand ourselves in relation to others. And so, she says, contempt can be bad. But the bigger problems are the judgments that trigger it. It can also help us gain self-assuredness when we need it. It buys us some much-needed confidence when we can't find any inside of ourselves. So maybe it can serve some good purposes. She comes back to Du Bois and brings up Jane Addams as well and talks about American pragmatism. And, she's going to say sometimes contempt is the only way to protect ourselves from further damage when abuse, disrespect, and manipulation wear us down. Contempt gives us shelter to salvage what is left. It doesn't make it justified or righteous. It means we need it to keep ourselves intact, right? Finally, the conclusion is called Loving the Wild. And she says, we've taken a closer look at some of the worms in the garden and we tried to get to know them a little bit better. Now you have a decision to make. What will you do with them? If I've convinced you, you shouldn't get rid of them and you shouldn't try to tame them, you might think all you can do is accept them. Fighting them is useless, might cause more harm than good. But this isn't right. Your negative emotions aren't an unfortunate fact that you have to face. You should love the worms in your garden, not merely tolerate them. So that's one of the key ideas there. And here she comes back to Thoreau and Walden and embracing the wild spaces within us. And she says, this is harder than it sounds, just to feel, letting our emotions be what they are. And facing the independence of your emotions means admitting that something at the core of who you are and what matters to you isn't fully up to you, which might be uncomfortable for some people. But that is what she is advocating in this book throughout all of these chapters. So that's the key ideas of the book. So I have quite a few good things to say about this book. As I said, it's very well written. I think that the construction of it as an extended argument with metaphors, quite, well thought out. And I think that she makes a really good case for the complexity of our emotions and for not attempting to impose some sort of, easy philosophical or psychological structure on them. I mentioned that I do like her treatment of Buddhism. It's got a recognition right off the bat. There's two things I really like. One is that there is no single Buddhism, right? There's a whole bunch of different schools, and they don't all necessarily teach, buy into, advocate exactly the same thing. The other thing I really like is she doesn't take Zen Buddhism, as so many Americans do, as being like the stand-in for Buddhism. The history of Mahayana Buddhism is far more complex, and actually real Zen studies the other schools as well. So I think that's a good point of this book. She knows what she's talking about. She's bringing in some interpretations of a lot of different philosophers and, doing compare and contrast with them. I think she gets them right pretty much all the time. They make sense within this framework. And so I'm pretty happy with I read these people myself and I'm like, yeah, okay, she's getting them correct here. I think it's important that she makes a good case for using the humanities to understand our emotions. That is a claim that probably needs to be stressed much, much more. And I like that she is examining these 4 sets of negative emotions. There's others we could have looked at as well, like grief, but she didn't want to try to analyze everything. And she's doing so in a nuanced way. She's not saying get rid of them, or here's the criteria for them being good. They're more complex, and that's a word that I think I've used already. But she recognizes the complexities, not just of our emotions, but what they arise out of: our lives, our characters, our relationships to other people, our social structures, our cultures that we live within. All of those play an important role. And ultimately, the book is about, I would say, understanding our emotions and not just feeling them, but feeling them in a way that could be preparatory to integrating them. So I think that although she's criticizing what she has called the cultivated emotion saints, I think that there's actually a good bit of compatibility here between what she's advocating and the, Aristotelian, Confucian, various other points of view. It's not like they're diametrically opposed, right? So I think that's a good point of this work. So, I'm pretty positive about it. I really only have 2 criticisms of the work in areas where I think she got things wrong. One is kind of minor, and it has to do with the discussion of the 7 deadly sins. She says, in the 6th century AD, Pope Gregory I added envy to the list of the 7 deadly sins in his Moralia on Job. His list of principal sins includes envy, along with vainglory, anger, melancholy, avarice, gluttony, and lust. According to Gregory, all of the principal sins have their origin in pride. So each of the principal sins gives birth to more sinful behavior. After Gregory's time, vainglory merged with pride, and melancholy became sloth and Roman Catholic teaching, but envy has remained on the list ever since. So is that correct? Yes and no. So Gregory's Moralia on Job is drawing upon the discussions of the 8 capital vices that start with Evagrius Ponticus, and then we find in John Cassian in both his institutes and in his conferences. And granted, envy is not among the 8 capital vices, but it is discussed at great length by both Evagrius and by Gregory and by other people who are looking at this. So, John Damasky, not just Gregory. So I think the story here, it's not just like Gregory is like, oh, let's also add envy. I mean, it's there in the text. So the story is a little bit of a conflation. The other thing that I'll say, it's a little odd, the discussion of Stoicism. She uses a term that, I understand where the term's coming from, but it's not the right term. So she talks about the new Stoics. And by this, she's bringing up, Ryan Holiday, software engineers, CEOs in Silicon Valley. She also talks about Tim Ferriss. Okay, so these are Stoic-like people. Tim Ferriss perhaps less than Ryan Holiday, but she calls them new Stoics. And actually, if she stuck with that, I'd be cool with that. But then she says that there's even a new Stoicism conference called Stoicon that meets in London and draws philosophers, business people, and members of the public from all over the world. So that's modern Stoicism. There's actually an organization, which I belong to, called Modern Stoicism. We're the ones who put on Stoicon. I've actually spoken at it. I've actually, is it 3 times now, run or organized Stoicon with other people. So yeah, we're not new Stoics. We're not Ryan Holiday. We're not Tim Ferriss. We're people who actually take classical Stoicism very seriously and try to apply it to things. So that's, a bit of a problem there. She does use the term not just once, but again later on in talking about, here we go. I wondered what the Stoics would think of the rise of new Stoicism. Well, actually, she says that some of them, like to think Epictetus would be one, would be horrified. For many of the Stoics, the idea of trying to become a sage without believing in the cosmology is like trying to be a priest without believing in God. So I think that gets Epictetus wrong. And there is actually a group out there, by the way, who are contemporary Stoics called the traditional Stoics, and they're the ones who believe that. So I think the treatment of Stoicism here is a bit confused when it comes to the new stuff, right? But those are the only criticisms I actually have of the work. All right, my final thoughts. I unreservedly recommend this book. I don't necessarily think that I would go the same route as she does. So I'm not endorsing all of the argument completely. I think I'm still more attracted to the cultivated emotion side of things, but it's a great book. It really is thoughtful, thought-provoking, and will be quite good for anybody who's interested in emotions and their connection with philosophy and personal development to check out and read. And it's making a really solid argument here that I think, whether you buy it or not, it does need to be engaged. So, unqualified, unreserved endorsement of the book. I would get a copy. You can find it at a lot of libraries. You can also buy a copy. There's a link below where you can go to Amazon and get it. And I'm really happy that Krista Thomason not only sent me a copy of this book, but came on and did an interview with me about the book and some of the topics involved with it. So that is my review.